Good morning to you all, and welcome to this session on social work regulation and practice education as part of Social Work Week. We have a very interesting session planned this morning and have colleagues from social work regulators from across the UK to share their work on practice education and learning. My name is Jonathan Monk and I'm the Assistant Director for Policy and Strategy at Social Work England. I will be chairing our panel session this morning. I lead on our overall approach to social work education and training, and we know that this is a subject of critical importance for safe and effective social work practice. Practice education has a vital role in teaching and assessing students on their placements to develop the skills, knowledge and behaviours to practice safely, confidently and to reflect the professional standards. Practice educators act as role models for the values which underpin the whole profession, and their role to inspire, nurture and challenge the future workforce cannot be underestimated. Their influence can have a career-long impact on the students they work with. I still remember with great admiration the two practice educators that supported me through my placements nearly 25 years ago. This experience was formative to my practice. It taught me the importance of reflection, and it was a privilege for me to be guided by two such exceptional practitioners. To introduce our panel, we will start with Dr. Tom Slater, Education Quality Assurance Manager at Social Care Wales. We will then hear from Anne Tavendale, Learning Development Manager with the Scottish Social Services Council. Catherine Maguire, Head of Workforce Development at the Northern Ireland Social Care Council, has joined us and will talk to us through their approach. And then finally, Rebecca Mulvaney, Policy Manager from Social Work England, will set out the developments in England. Tom, can we start with you, please?
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. Boradar, my name's Tom Slater, and I'm the Education Quality Assurance Manager. Let's express our thanks to colleagues in Social Work England for setting this up. It's very much appreciated. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you. I have not provided slides, partly because I spent the past 8.5 years as a social work lecturer, and I feel I've done my time giving people lots of slides to look at for a little while. So I thought today we'd have a bit of a break, and what I'll do is a very quick verbal overview of practice education in Wales. As Jonathan mentioned, practice educators play an absolutely essential role. They're instrumental in training the next generation of social workers. I think that's something that's common to our approach across all 4 nations. And I think that's a really positive thing that we all recognise the value that they bring to this. That said, I do think that sometimes practice educators aren't always just given the space and recognition they deserve for this. And actually, this is really nice to see an event specifically around this topic area. In Wales, we're very fortunate to have a range of different providers who provide social work, practice educator training. And the way that practice educator training is facilitated very much mirrors the way that we approach social work education generally. And there's a very big emphasis on partnership. And partnership, by this we mean both in terms of local authority employers or other employers and education providers working together to ensure effective training and development, but also in terms of actually recognising it's a partnership between students and practice educators in that learning process. Both parties have a key element to be involved in that element to it. So the partnership for us, the emphasis of values on the strengths and the skills that both the student brings and the practice educator brings together are a key part of this. The way we facilitate this in Wales is that we encourage people who are at least 2 years full-time or pro rata equivalent to undertake this training. It's a 20-credit module, and that can be done at level 6s or 7. I use the words level here in terms of credit qualification framework for Wales, which is very similar, I understand, to colleagues in England and in Northern Ireland. I believe Scotland's a little bit different in terms of their level, so apologies if that doesn't quite translate well for those of you who might be in Scotland. In terms of that, that's really important because one of the things it also allows people to do is when they do a social work degree, they're finishing at level 6 if they're undergraduate or level 7 if they're postgraduate. We really wanted to make sure that the the practice educator award could be done at either level, either as a progression of the ongoing development or because we wanted to maintain the level they're at. So we got that flexibility of the options around that. One of the things that really comes through us as well is that practice educators themselves obviously are assessed by experienced practice educators themselves in that process. So it's almost a sort of continuity of exemplifying good practice as an experienced practice educator with a new practice educator, which again forms into the practice of our student. We think that's quite a nice way, and again, I think that's common to all of us, about having that ability to sort of pass on those good practice abilities over the course of different experiences and sort of generations of social work education, if you want to put it that way. One of the things that we have around this as well is an emphasis on the values. And our practice educator guidance and the rules that we have talks quite a lot about national occupational standards, which are kind of benchmark for assessing capabilities, which again, I think is fairly common to us all. And the code of professional practice, which comes through a lot. And we've put a lot of emphasis on trying to make that a key part of this process. And obviously recognition of the quality, the QA benchmarks, which I say around this. One of the things that we've talked a lot about recently is the idea of on-sites and off-sites, and about the terminology and the phrasing of these concepts, because with COVID, inevitably the way that we operate this, the idea of an observation, has shifted and changed. And I think at the moment we're in a bit of a lag where we haven't quite caught up with new ways of working and some of the terminology and approaches that we have. So I think we're looking at a field which is evolving quickly around this, particularly when it comes to the idea of actually what it is to support a student in placement. How do we observe? What's the difference between an online observation as opposed to a face-to-face observation? There are strengths and limitations to both. And I think that's an area which we're still going forward with, and there's been some really interesting bits of innovative practice that we've seen come to the fore through COVID, and hopefully we can sustain that into the future as well. And I think one of the things we've said, practice educators in Wales are very much facilitated by the local authority. It's their responsibility through the sort of funding we provide to make that happen. And it's interesting the different ways and different approaches that are given to supporting practice educators in that approach. And again, I think we might talk about this later on, is about actually how do we support practice educators in this role, both in terms of getting them the time and the space and the resources they need to train and to be able to keep doing it, but also in terms of thinking about actually how we sort of provide the financial resourcing behind us as well, both as regulators and as local authority employers and as HEIs, education providers. So lots of things happening. I'm going to stop talking at this point because you probably had enough of me talking about the framework, but I think some of the key points you'll emphasise is a really big emphasis on values that come through in this. And it is about looking at this partnership between students and between practice educators, between education providers, between employers and the students. All these parties have to work together, and that's a really instrumental part of both of the training programme and of a successful practice education experience.
Tom, many thanks. Really interesting, particularly interested in how we are engaging the new ways of working in this new world. I think the opportunities for online practice and opportunities for online observation as part of the practice education role is really interesting. I think it offers lots of dilemmas as well as lots of opportunities. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'm now going to hand over to Catherine, who will talk to us about the approach in Northern Ireland.
I think actually it's myself. I think Catherine's after me, Jonathan.
Oh, I'm sorry, Anne.
No,
so
no,
Anne, please go ahead.
That's absolutely fine. Hi everybody, I'm Anne Tavendale. I'm one of the Learning and Development Managers within the Scottish Social Service Council, and I manage the Education and Quality Assurance function. I do have a couple of slides for you today. I promise it won't be death by PowerPoint, but I put together some slides more for information that some people may wish to take away for reference. First slide, please. So in terms of social work education in Scotland, what does that look like? Well, we have 9 universities in Scotland who all deliver undergraduate, postgraduate qualifications, full, part-time and distance learning. SSC approve, monitor and quality assure all of the social work degrees that are delivered in Scotland. In common with the other 3 nations, we have a minimum number of practice learning days which all social work students need to undertake, and that is 200 with a minimum of 160 directly assessed days. We're currently looking, again, because of all the COVID contingency measures we're put in place, we're currently reviewing those practice learning, teaching and assessment requirements and trying to sort of tweak them so that they're fit for the future. I've given you a few statistics really just to give you a sense of the scale of practice learning in Scotland. Obviously that looks very different across the 4 nations. On average, we have about 500 newly qualified social workers annually entering the workforce. Anecdotally, we're getting evidence that probably the only people who are applying for social work roles currently in Scotland are NQSWs. I think there's a real challenge over the demography of the existing workforce. Another key issue for us is the split of practice learning between local authority and third sector. We know that the majority of social workers who come off the courses and onto our register initially go into local authority settings. However, during their training, it can vary between 25 to 60% of those students who are able to access really good quality local authority placements. So that continues to be an ongoing area for development with us. We have really good relationships with all of our social work education providers. These have been strengthened during COVID. We've had to make significant material changes across all of the programmes just to get people moving through over the past 3 or 4 years. And we're currently embarking on a significant bit of work with all of the programmes to think about, okay, what does social work education need to look like now going into this new post-COVID hybrid world that we're all still trying to navigate and find our way around. Critical to all of our opportunities and challenges is how we fund social work education. So we're currently undertaking a full national review of all of the pots of money that support social work education in Scotland. Many of the postgraduate bursaries at SSSC disbursed and the practice learning fees have not kept pace with inflation. So essentially there's capacity issues there. However, we're really fortunate that applications continue to far exceed places in Scotland, which I think is something that we need to be thankful for in the current environment. Next slide, please. So how do we deliver practice learning? Well, I think as Tom has said, and I would echo much of what you've said, Tom, absolutely it has to be in partnership. It can't not be in partnership. We reviewed social work education in Scotland, and that review concluded in 2016. It concluded that social work would remain generic in Scotland, and the key finding was that we needed to find ways of having much stronger co-ownership of social work education. It's not just the job of the universities to prepare the next generation of social workers, it's equally a responsibility of employers. So to that end, we established a national social work education partnership, and that partnership is chaired by the Office of the Chief Social Work Advisor in Government. It comprises of all of the partners you would expect, employers, Social Work Scotland, universities, SSSC, etc. So as part of that review, we've actually revised the standards in social work education to make them more modern, to have a stronger emphasis on ethical standards and values, I think similar to what you were saying, Tom. And we've also broadened the literacy and numeracy requirements to try and widen access. We've also we're developing a mandatory newly qualified social worker supported year. And we're also planning to review our overall rules and requirements for social work training. They were developed in 2003, though it feels like the whole of the world has shifted. I've been around since before 2003 in social work education, so have watched all of the various changes. SSSC also approve all of the specialist awards that enable social workers to become practice educators, and we currently have 4 providers of those across Scotland, so that's a real advantage for us. And we're working with the Social Work Education Partnership to support ongoing CPL for all practice educators. Next slide, please. Oops. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, we're on it. Apologies. Yeah, continuing the theme of developing practice learning in partnership, I thought it would be helpful just to put up a couple of the key challenges, which I'm sure will be shared across all of the nations. And I think Tom mentioned some of them already. Sufficiency of qualified practice educators within practice settings. We know there are many social workers who have undertaken the practice learning qualifications, but not many of them are enabled to continue to practice in that role. And I think we know that that has forever and a day been one of our kind of key challenges, along with the sufficiency of learning opportunities within local authority settings. So we have a whole range of initiatives underway to try and improve in those areas. In terms of COVID-related opportunities, I think there have been many. In terms of the delivery of our practice learning qualification courses, they very swiftly moved to online and hybrid, and I think that made it much more accessible for a lot of our workforce. We also trialled simulated and virtual practice learning for some of our social work students. That worked really well as preparation for practice, not quite so well as a direct replacement for assessed practice learning. We also piloted much longer placements, so running the two key assessed placements together, which meant that students were out for much longer times, and that has been really popular, particularly with local authorities. Upskilling to remotely assess. Don't think any of us knew how we would assess remotely at the start of the pandemic. We've all had to learn together and are still continuing to learn in terms of how we now go back or don't go back to what was before. And I think crucially, we commissioned a 7-year longitudinal study on following a cohort of NQSWs, which has helped us with really, really important insights into the early stages of social workers' careers. Next slide, please. I've really just put this here to let you see what our NQSW supported year model looks like, what its core components are. I'll leave that there for reference. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. So we're in the early stages of implementing the newly qualified social worker supported year. Very aware that in the other parts of the UK, there have been supported years in place for some time, and it's taken us a while to get to the point where we've got buy-in for this to be mandatory. We are planning on rolling this out nationally from September 2024. In the meantime, we have approximately half of local authorities we've currently given grants to, and they are currently developing the model in their localities. And this year, we've received more funding from Scottish Government to give additional grants to some of the new areas to bring them on stream. We have developed a wonderful NQSW supported year website with a whole suite of resources on supervision to support line managers to provide supervision, guidance and templates, really to try and make it easy for people. And we also offer lots of support sessions for the existing site. So we're working really hard to take that work forward. Next slide, please. Yeah, I thought it was worth mentioning just the national landscape, which is a very busy policy landscape at the moment in Scotland. As you may be aware, we're in the very early stages of developing a national care service. As part of that, a national social work agency will be set up to provide a national framework for the social work workforce. Can't really say too much more about that at the moment, and obviously there's a lot of political changes taking place in Scotland at the moment. Our national workforce strategy is a key strategy that's informing a lot of what we do at the moment. I thought it might be helpful for you just to see the range of policy drivers that we're having to be cognizant of in the current environment, including a review into modernising inspection, scrutiny and regulation. Final slide for me. A couple of useful links that will take you directly to the newly qualified supported worker website, and also to our other website that we have for all practice educators, students and managers as well. So I've probably gone over time, but thank you very much for this opportunity.
And that was brilliant. And I think everybody here would definitely be able to relate to some of those challenges that you set out. I think particularly in relation to the availability and capacity within local authorities to provide appropriate practice placements. Really, you know, that absolutely is a huge challenge for this area of work. Really interested to hear how the mandatory supported year of employment for newly qualified social workers, how that goes in 2024. That sounds like a really exciting development and something that will hopefully have a significant benefit and value for social workers as they make that transition from their initial education and training into paid work. Really interesting. So thank you very much. And we will watch with interest how those things continue to develop. Thank you, Anne. Catherine, can I hand over to you now to talk us through the arrangements and approach in Northern Ireland?
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, and good morning, colleagues across the UK. We're delighted to be part of this session today. As it says on the slide, my name is Catherine Maguire, and I'm currently Interim Head of Workforce Development at the Social Care Council, a registered social worker, and I have been a practice educator in the past as well in various forms. Before I move on into my presentation, just to say that Northern Ireland is obviously the smaller nation of the four UK nations. We have, as of today, 6,528 registered social workers. In Northern Ireland, we also, social work students are required to register and sign up to our standards of conduct. And today we have 772 social work students registered with the Social Care Council. I'm going to share some information today really about our history and our structures around the delivery of social work education and practice learning in particular that I suppose reflects our size and scale, which will look quite different to yours. So next slide, please, Philippa. So the policy context for the delivery of social work education really goes back to the late 90s, and that's in common with the other nations across the UK at that time, and led to a reform of social work education in 2001, introduction of workforce regulation again in common with the other countries, and the introduction of a generic social work degree as the threshold or qualification for social workers in Northern Ireland. So all social workers that qualify here will qualify with a degree either through a fast track relevant graduate programme or an undergraduate programme. And then our post-qualifying framework is at we heard earlier about level 7, so it's level 7. So our professional practice framework, which supports the CPD of social workers in Northern Ireland, is at master's level. And as part of the reform at that time, we also had revised arrangements for the approval and quality assurance of professional training based on standards set by the Social Care Council. And practice learning was part of that process. And we also had the establishment of the Northern Ireland Degree in Social Work Partnership. And really, I suppose that was a more formal recognition of the partnership arrangements that already existed to support social work education in Northern Ireland. And if you move on to the next slide, it'll provide an overview as to what this looks like. So when I thought about whether we would provide slides today or not, I think it was this slide that I thought it's very difficult to explain without people seeing. And I suppose really what you can see on screen is the partnership arrangements to support social work education are at all levels, from government down, at strategic levels in terms of our Department of Health, who are our sponsoring body, and then within the council itself, we have a strategic advisory group, which you'll see is made up from representatives of employers, approved course providers, our participation partnership, who are a service user and carer group within the council, and a range of other people who are important within social work education. I really can't overstate the importance of the degree in social work partnership in the delivery of social work education and ensuring consistency across all programmes. We have 3 approved programmes in Northern Ireland at 2 of our traditional universities, and then the Open University programme was approved in 2020. And we have just under 300 funded places in Northern Ireland each year as well. So the degree partnership have responsibility for the coordination of a range of areas across social work education, including the admissions to university. So while our students apply to particular courses through UCAS, we have a regional admissions process, which means that the interview process for social work students is agreed regionally and organised by the degree partnership as well. So all social work students coming into social work training in Northern Ireland have a very similar and standardised process in terms of admission. I suppose the other key role that's important to this presentation is in relation to practice learning, and that's around policy delivery and development in relation to practice learning, but also the allocation of practice learning. So annually we have approximately 900 opportunities that are provided, and they are allocated regionally through the degree partnership. So all of the employers, so the employer information in terms of the availability of opportunities, and the course providers information in terms of students requiring practice learning are brought together and allocated regionally across the piece. It's a daunting task, I understand, from those who are directly involved in the process, but works very well. And we also have, as part of the degree partnership, we have linked collaborative partnerships with our course providers, and you'll see them on the screen: Queen's Open University and Ulster University, and Further Education partnership as well. So next slide, please, Philippa. Our rules for the approval of the degree in social work, I'm sure, are very similar to the rules that other people are familiar with, but they do include requirements around teaching, practice learning and assessment. Next slide, please. So we have standards for practice learning for the degree in social work, and the purpose of those standards are to ensure that every social work student is assured of access to practice learning opportunities that are appropriately resourced, planned and managed to enable them to meet the specified practice learning outcomes. And we have within our standards as well the practice learning requirements that students are required to be given the opportunity to meet. So, for example, our social work students in Northern Ireland, we strive to ensure that they have one statutory practice learning experience, that they have experience in children's services, that the staffing to support their practice learning is well resourced as well. And the standards contain requirements for course providers and for practice learning providers. So both for, I suppose, the universities and for the employers that are providing those opportunities. In terms of staffing, we require, I suppose, the same level of experience of our staff based in universities who are teaching students and of those who are involved in practice teaching or learning itself. So we require that they have completed their assessed year in employment and they have a minimum of 2 years in practice. And obviously that they're qualified social workers. So all practice teachers in Northern Ireland are required to complete the practice teaching programme, which is a year-long programme at master's level, or to be to be on the programme at that point in time, so that they're completing. And that ensures that we can say with confidence that social work students will have the same level of experience in terms of their practice learning. Next slide, please. We also, our standards also require us to approve practice learning providers. We currently have 19 designated practice learning providers, so they are employers who have been through a process of approval with the Social Care Council, and they are in statutory, third and private sector organisations. Within the statutory sector, about 60 to 70% of social workers in Northern Ireland work within our integrated health and social care system. So our 5 health and social care trusts are all designated practice learning providers, but we also have providers within other statutory sectors, so our Education Authority and in our justice sector, so within the Youth Justice Agency and in the Probation Board for Northern Ireland. When it changed elsewhere, Northern Ireland retained the social work qualification as the qualification for probation officers in Northern Ireland, so we have opportunities there as well. We have a very, very vibrant third sector in Northern Ireland, and there are many practice learning opportunities provided there as well. Some of those, the big national third sector organisations that you will all be familiar with, and some are small local organisations within the third or community sector that provide practice learning as well. And I've already said we have over 700 learning opportunities annually. I suppose one of the benefits from both our partnership arrangements and the practice learning standards for us are that employers have confidence in the system and the process and in the quality of practice learning that their newly qualified social workers will have when they come to them as AYE social workers or assessed year in employment. And practice learning is consistently positively reviewed by students on the degree programmes as well. I mean, that's a quote from our last review of the degree in 2018, but practice learning is always very highly rated by social work students in terms of the elements of the degree and what was important in preparing them for social work practice. So I'll stop there, Jonathan, and let you introduce the next presenter.
Thank you, Catherine. I mean, that quote that you've just finished on sums it all up, doesn't it, really? Just what a fundamental role that practice educators play, and as a way of setting social workers up for the rest of their career and the impact and influence that that can have. Really interesting, and thank you for that. Really interested in the structure that you set out on your slide, and your reference to your strategic advisory group, how you engage course providers, practice educators, employers, and people with lived experience and students in the overall development of your approach to education and training. That's something that we're really committed to in England, and something that we're establishing through an education and training advisory forum. So really interested to hear your experience, and we'll have to make sure that we share notes really on what works and how to approach that. Really interesting. Thank you, Catherine. Rebecca, can I hand over to you now to talk through the arrangements and approach in England?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Jonathan. Afternoon, everyone. I'm a policy manager with Social Work England, and my focus is on education and training. And I've been with Social Work England since 2019, and prior to this role was in our education quality assurance team. So I've also been out and inspected some social work courses, just in case I make reference to that. I just thought it'd be really nice to get us started with a couple of reflections that I've been thinking about as could we go back a slide? Sorry, Philippa. Thank you. Get us started with a couple of reflections as I've been listening to colleagues from across the UK on the sort of some of the similarities that we share and some of the differences that we share as well. So there's certainly similarities in terms of the value that we place on the role of the practice educator within initial social work education and training, and the importance of those partnerships as well. It's so vital between education providers, students, practice educators, and employers as well, without which you can't effectively run a social work course. But some of the differences are that you may notice that we're a much younger regulator in England. We've only been regulating since 2019, and we're still building our standards and building our guidance and building the tools that we have to effectively regulate all the areas that we want to in relation to social work education and training. And also one of the other differences is scale, and I think this is worth mentioning because it does shape each individual regulator's approach to how they approach their work in their own country. So we have 83 course providers in England that we regulate, and that currently means that we actually regulate 297 social work courses, and that's just qualifying social work courses. So we also set standards for the courses that train approved mental health professionals, for example, and we also register approved mental health professionals as well as a sort of post-qualifying programme. And there's a huge variety of routes into the profession in England, obviously undergraduate and postgraduate courses, but we also have degree apprenticeships and we have fast track programmes, full-time, part-time provision, as will be likely found elsewhere across the UK. But a much greater variety of potential routes, and that affects the shape and form of social work programs as well as their length, and it also affects the shape that placements can take as well. They might be sort of longer and sort of encompass almost the entire course, or they might be slightly more broken down and condensed. But we do share as well with other regulators that minimum requirement for 200 days of practice-based learning for all social work students, 30 of which can be skills days. And we also set requirements around a minimum of 2 contrasting placements, and that contrast can be explored in different ways. And one of those placements must take place within a statutory setting. And the key for defining that statutory setting is the statutory tasks that the student can undertake whilst they're on that placement. And those placements can be undertaken in a huge variety of settings as well. We don't directly regulate placement providers, but we do meet with placement providers on a regular basis through our approval and reapproval activity for our inspection activity. That can be schools, hospitals, councils, local authorities, it can be charity sector, third sector, private sector. I had the delight to meet a few years ago a practice educator and a student who were both based in the Royal Navy, which was a huge novelty and not something that I'd come across previously. But there's a huge variety across England in where social work students are undertaking their practice-based learning, but then also likewise, obviously, where those practice educators are based and whether they're off-site or on-site as well. Could we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. And just click through it a couple of times, Philip, because there's some text to come up. Thank you. So our main relationship that we have currently with practice educators is actually through their registration with us as social workers, and obviously the requirement that they have to meet our professional standards, and then through our education and training standards. So we have a less direct, in some ways, relationship with practice educators than some of our colleagues in the other nations of the UK may do at this point in time. And I've just got a couple of examples here on screen of our education and training standards and how they relate to practice education, because some of this detail is maybe something that people haven't looked at before, and I find it really interesting. So if you look at 2.6, for example, this is a standard which directly addresses our requirements in relation to practice educators. So we expect education providers to ensure that practice educators are on our register, they're registered social workers, and that they have the relevant and current knowledge, skills and experience to support safe and effective learning. And what that looks like in practice is when we go out and inspect social work courses and social work education providers, we ask questions about, well, how do you sort of onboard practice educators, and what training do you provide to them, and what inductions do you provide to them, and how do you work in partnership with their employers if they're based on site within a sort of local authority, say, for example, to work in partnership with their employer to make sure that they're supported and they have the time to undertake that relevant training to keep their knowledge up to date. Or if they're off-site, even, how do you engage with them over the long term? Do they have refresher training? Do you sort of have regular drop-in sessions? Do you run conferences? It can take all different types of shape and form, but we're looking for that sort of consistent engagement and partnership between the practice educator, the education provider, and the employer to ensure that the students are going to be supported. And if you look at 3.8 as well, we also ask questions around the sort of staffing and the provision of practice educator numbers. Does that align with your student recruitment? Does it align with your ambitions for the course? Say, for example, where education providers speak to us about expanding student numbers, then we want to see evidence that there's going to be enough practice educators in the local area, in the region, to ensure that that expansion or the continuation of that current course recruitment is sufficient, because that's really important to us as well. But then there's also sort of reference to the work of practice educators interwoven across the standards, even where it might be less explicit in the standards themselves. We can sometimes find that reference to practice educators in our guidance, or it's something that, again, we come up and speak to education providers, practice educators, students and employers about when we're out on inspection. So if you look at 2.3, for example, ensuring that students have appropriate induction, supervision and support, that's obviously, there's a huge role there for the practice educator. So that's what we're looking at when we sort of look at that standard. What role does the practice educator play in that? And how are the students feeling about how that relationship is working for them? And again, if you look at 5.3, ensuring that there's a thorough and effective process for ensuring the ongoing suitability of students' conduct, character and health. Of course, while students are on placement, there's a huge role for the practice educator in that as well. And we'll be looking for how the practice educator is supported by staff at the university to navigate those situations where they potentially might have concerns about a student's conduct or their fitness to practice, and how then those processes sort of are clearly defined and put in place to ensure that the practice educator knows what to do to have that support themselves, but then also to support the student or raise things to the university. So there's a huge sort of presence of the practice educator throughout our education and training standards and our guidance, and through what we look at when we go out and we inspect social work courses. We are currently, because we introduced new education and training standards in 2021, we are currently going through a process of reapproving all of those 297 courses in England against those new education and training standards, looking at some of the standards like I've given examples of here. And as part of that inspection process, we always meet with practice educators. We always want to have those conversations directly with them to see how they feel about their role, the support that they're getting, their relationship with the students that they're supporting, and what their employer is providing as well. So it's, you know, it really reflects that partnership and the importance of getting it right, and also their role in wider course development processes. So does the university value them as a partner in sort of ensuring that sort of ongoing course design and development, and getting the practice educators' feedback, and them understanding the sort of course curriculum and the wider assessment of students, so they've got a well-rounded sense of their place within the sort of development of that student as a whole, not just within the practice learning environment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as I've mentioned, we're at a sort of earlier stage in our journey, really, in terms of the sort of things that we have in place to be able to, you know, enable us to have a closer relationship with practice educators, which is something that we want to have. You know, we are here to uphold public protection. It's really important that we ensure that every aspect of the social work student's training and development is subject to, you know, a proportionate approach from us in terms of making sure that it's regulated, quality assured, that we have oversight of it. And it's really important to us for those reasons that we develop a closer relationship with practice educators and have confidence in their training, in ensuring their sort of ongoing practice as practice educators, and, you know, ensuring that they are kept up to date and they feel supported and they're able to undertake and continuing that role. We are, of course, also aware of the sort of challenges around this role and the sort of challenges in relation to the recruitment and retention of practice educators. And that's something that we're keenly interested in being able to help support some of the solutions to those challenges where we can. And some of the things that we're going to be able to explore as a regulator are annotation. So should practice educators have annotation on their register with us? Now, there could be some benefits to that, because in all honesty, we don't currently know how many practice educators there are in England, and how you define the number of practice educators in England is also a question that might not even be that easy to answer. Would that be people that have undertaken a practice education qualification, maybe even several years ago, but haven't had a student for some time? Would it be people who currently are supervising a student? It probably would need to be a middle ground between the two. But annotation would be a potential way forwards for us to offer some recognition of the training and of the role and of the risk inherent there in being a sort of gatekeeper around a student's education and training and their progression, and also allowing us more direct access to information such as how many practice educators are there, where are they, who are they, how can we build a closer relationship with them? But it's not the only option that we're going to explore in it, and it might not be the most proportionate option for us to take forwards. So there's other options for us around sort of continuing professional development and how we potentially specialise some of that for practice educators, and could say, for example, say if you're a practice educator, one piece of your CPD could be focused on that aspect of your role. We could also introduce standards for the courses that train practice educators, which is something that doesn't currently sit with us. We don't have a register of the courses that train practice educators, and the practice educator professional standards currently sit outside of us with the professional body BASWA. So that's another area that we could potentially have a look at. We could also look at making revisions to our education and training standards over the coming years. So I've given some examples of our current standards, but there's potentially more that we could do there in saying, you know, in sort of enhancing those standards and ensuring, you know, there are requirements of practice educators, but also the employers and the education providers that support those practice educators. They could be sort of made a little bit enhanced, more robust, potentially, based on the findings that we take from our inspections of courses and the reapproval cycle. So various options for us to explore, some of which are things that are already in place in other nations within the UK, and obviously we'll be looking to our colleagues to see how they deliver these things and taking some learning from that. So our next steps over the coming year, we really want to better understand the models of practice education across England. One of the things that we have got a sense of is that it's not always done in exactly the same way. Education providers, in partnership with their employer partners, do approach how they sort of structure practice education differently. We're quite interested in understanding that and trying to see if there's maybe some better ways of doing it than others so that we could share that best practice. And we want to build on what works. And I think sometimes it's not always easy to disseminate what works and what doesn't. And that's maybe a role that we can play that would be quite constructive and helpful. And we really obviously also want to develop our own approach to the regulation of social workers who take on the role of practice educators. And so I'm just going to give a brief summary of some of the things that we're already doing. So we've commissioned our own research in this area, and that's going to be really exciting. I think it's going to be underway very, very shortly. And it's a really exciting partnership, which I look forward to being able to talk about more publicly very soon. And that's going to include things like a literature review, looking at current research into practice education. It's going to include a breakdown of different models of practice education currently being used by education providers in the UK. And it's also going to delve into the sort of perceptions, the challenges, the barriers to recruitment and retention of practice educators as well. So there's quite a nice broad scope there, but we think it's probably going to give us what we need as a regulator to make some decisions going forward about how we're going to approach the regulation of practice education, because we want it to be an evidence-based approach, and we don't want to do something which could potentially exasperate a situation where we know that there's already some strain and some stress. We want to get it right.
Rebecca,
yeah.
Sorry, can we sum up in a second so that we just have some time for some questions? Sorry to move you on, but if you could sum up, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly. We've got a lot of learning to take from the reapproval cycle. We've started to include questions around practice education in our annual monitoring, and we're also engaging in external research. And of course, we're also engaged with external national developments, such as the reform of children's social care and the development of an early career framework, which we see being very relevant to practice education as well. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So much going on, and I'm always in awe of your knowledge and your expertise in this field. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Of particular interest of something that's we're developing and that will be happening in England soon is that we're really wanting to develop that conversation with practice education, really starting to think about what's a national approach to this really important subject. So we will be convening a national meeting in the next few weeks and months to really start those conversations happening, really looking at what the roles are and what agencies need to do, what the sector needs to do to really address this and make sure that we're supporting practice education in the way that it needs to, and that it has the prominence and the profile. We've got some time just for a couple of questions. We asked for some questions to be submitted both a couple of weeks ago via some of our social media channels, but also we've had some question and answers put in the chat this morning. So the first question that I'm going to direct to all of you, but Tom, we haven't heard from you for a little while, so it would be good to get a response from you. Just in relation to how can we as regulators help to ensure that practice education is given the respect and the recognition that it deserves within the social work profession? What's your response to that?
I think as regulators, we've got an interesting position of needing to hold people to account, but also to encourage and promote positive change as much as anything else. And I think that's something we really need to try and focus on. A lot of what we're thinking at the moment is about trying to work with employers and HEIs to think about actually how they recognise the role, particularly with employers thinking about the time they give people to do this, and the resources that are available to this. We've recently been quite fortunate to be able to secure access for all social workers in Wales to the NHS Wales e-library, so actually access resources. And I think that's one of the things that we forget, that practice educators who might be doing this for a while may not have regular ongoing access to resources to help guide their thinking with contemporary research, with contemporary evidence. That's a really helpful way of developing that. It's a small thing, but it hopefully makes a big difference in terms of be able to engage with the students who are learning and using contemporary literature, be able to do that themselves. But a large part of it is about thinking through the terms and conditions that we work with, which we have partial influence over, but I think it's a key part of it. Sorry.
Thank you, Tom. And can I ask you the same question?
Yes, as you were talking, Tom, I was just thinking about the current developments in Scotland to take forward a post-qualifying advanced skills framework for all social workers. And I think we know that as part of that, we need to write into that the expectations. We already have in the codes of practice the expectation that all social workers will contribute to the education of the next generation, but it's kind of tricky to robustly kind of regulate that. So I think where we want to get to in the future is a much stronger footing where social workers come off courses, become NQSWs, and then fairly swiftly move on to support students, but that is recognised and that is embedded within job descriptions and within employers' expectations as well, because I guess in common with all of the other 3 nations at the moment, it's very much a goodwill model. It's kind of patchy, it's inconsistent. Very often it's the individual practice educators who are driving through their own motivation and commitment, continuation with the role, rather than local authorities saying, well, actually, we've invested in training you, how are we going to use you going forward? So I do think we need to more formally write in expectations if we're actually going to embed and give the respect that practice education deserves.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting and really helpful. Can I ask Catherine, our next question, I'll direct to you. So do we have a role as regulators in supporting the recruitment and retention of practice educators? How best could we achieve this?
Well, I think we do have a role, and at the Social Care Council we have a role in promotion of social work more broadly, and practice education is part of that. And I think one of the ways that we draw attention to the importance and value of practice educators or practice teachers, as they are in Northern Ireland, the practice teaching programme is approved within our professional and practice framework. So social workers who complete that programme also achieve the specialist award within the professional and practice framework, and we celebrate that with them at our annual awards process every year. I think in terms of the regulation as well, in terms of the standards that are required, that brings its own value to practice learning, and you know, within the wider social work community, it's understood that practice learning providers, practice teachers, and course providers are all required to achieve a particular standard in order to be part of that, and I think that probably confers its own value on the role. It's an absolutely critical role in terms of the future of social work right across our countries, and I think we heard that reflected in people's comments earlier. I think everybody in social work values, and anything that we can do as regulators to raise the status of that, I think, is really important.
Thank you, Catherine. What we've heard this morning is just the difference and diverse ways in which each of the 4 nations have approached this subject, both in terms of having more experience and evidence around the relationship of a regulator with practice education, but also the Social Work England experience of really just developing and evolving our approach and really understanding what that relationship looks like and what our roles and responsibilities are in supporting this part of the profession. What I think we're hearing is there is a real scope for learning across the 4 nations. I've seen some questions that have come in from the chat around making sure that our approaches align and really making sure that we are collaborating, that we are having those conversations so that we can learn from that experience and we can learn from how other regulators have approached it. There's a real commitment to do that, I think, across the 4 nations. We all contribute to an alliance to make sure that we share those developments and we share our findings from research and we share our experiences and our learning. So really important that we continue to build on that commitment and to make sure that happens. We've now run out of time. This is such an important and interesting topic, isn't it? And I think it's something that we could all spend so much time talking about, really. This is just part of the start of that conversation. But that really is all time that we have for this particular session. I'm sure you will all agree with me that this has been really positive to have a session dedicated to thinking about the role of practice education for social work regulation. It just remains for me to thank all of our panel members for their insight and contributions, and to thank you all for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the session. Thank you and goodbye.